thank you so much for being here with us today. And I think it will be a nice start to talk about what does it take to make a political leader? What's political leadership?
So I think, what do political leaders do that we most need them to do? And it's two very simple things. The first is to help a community or a group of people know what their purpose is, what goal they want to reach. So it's to either inject ideas or help the group find what it wants to do together. And the second thing is an effective leader mobilizes the resources of the group to achieve that goal. So human beings can do so much on their own, but a political leader needs to be able to help them together work out what they need to do together and mobilize them to achieve it. So what do you need to do that? That's the other part of your question. I think there are three absolutely crucial qualities that good political leaders need. And the first is a selfless vision of what they're achieving. In other words, people, if you're going to lead people, they need to follow you. You can't be, as one head of an international organization said to me, I'm leading, it's just nobody's following me. And that's not leadership.
Not at all.
But to trust you, people have to know that you're purpose-driven. And I think political leadership needs a leader whose purpose is something other than their own advancement. It's got to be a selfless vision of leadership. It's got to be a selfless set of purposes that everybody else shares in. The second quality I think leaders need is competence. Competence means the ability and the discipline to inform themselves, to know what really is the right decision given the information at that time. The ability to take advice from a lot of different people in a moment of crisis and to synthesize that advice. That's competence. And the third thing that I think leaders need is they have to be trusted always to act with fairness and with justice. So to treat people fairly and to treat people against a clear, understandable moral code. So leaders have to be trustable in that sense, just and fair. And so we're not looking for angels when we look for good political leaders, but we need to find people and we need to test candidates and ask ourselves, do they have these three qualities? Because in my view, those are three qualities necessary for leadership.
And non-negotiable ones, right?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to making a tough decision, it's also a person's decision, right, on behalf of others. So how does one develop a sense of fairness, or how can I incorporate different visions if I'm making a decision on behalf of a larger group or of a country? Where can we develop those skills?
Well, I think it's really interesting to watch those leaders who lose their ability to listen to the group, who lose their ability to question and let others challenge them and start substituting their own personal view for the view of their government.
Okay.
That's dangerous. In the Chilcot report, they said Tony Blair wrote a memo to President Bush, and his memo began with the words, "Whatever happens, I will be with you." I, not the United Kingdom, the country for which I'm Prime Minister, which is why I'm writing to you, but I. And I think that's what happens when a leader spends a lot of time in power. They start, in some cases, they start conflating their personal decision-making, their personal views with the views that they hold as an office holder. And I think a good political leader is one who is always speaking on behalf of the group that he or she is mobilizing.
That's a very tough task, actually. So you are the Dean of Oxford University's Blavatinik School of Government. What's the importance of a School of Government? And is it relevant nowadays? Is it more relevant than ever, actually, right? So
I think it is. I think no matter how good a private company or a charity is, the difference that you can make through one very successful charity is always quite small compared to the enormous difference, negative or positive, that a government can make by getting something a bit better or a bit worse. So quite small improvements in government can lead to huge positive effects for people. So it's kind of surprising that the world has so many business schools, It has so many schools of social entrepreneurship. There are so many places you can learn to go and excel if you want to be any kind of professional, almost except for a professional in government. And I think therefore it's really important for the world to have places which take that challenge on frontally and say, right, what are the problems of government that we need to research, that we need to educate people to deal with, that we need to engage with the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, governments, so that they can collaboratively find solutions. So that's what the School of Government was born to do.
Right. And probably it will also tackle another issue. How do we attract good and talented people to civil service or to the government? I mean, we are seeing not many people interested in political parties or becoming a politician or even taking part in government. So what's happening? I mean, how can we attract good and talented people to the most complex jobs that are, right?
Yeah. And I think that's really important, that governments have to be able to attract the smartest, brightest, most entrepreneurial people. That's why Lemann Blavatinik gave the money to Oxford to start the School of Government, and I thoroughly believe that. So what do we need to do to improve that? Well, one reason why really smart, bright, ambitious, entrepreneurial people don't go into government is because they don't think that they will be able to make a really big difference in government. They think that either they'll be held back or that government will outsource the parts that they would be most excited to do, or they won't be given the chance to make a difference. And that's, I think we can change that. A second reason why they think they won't make a difference is that so many governments are stacked with political appointments. And that if you're a young, brilliant, ambitious, not necessarily partisan person, you don't belong to a political party,
right,
but you really want to do public service, it's not very attractive if you're never going to be promoted on merit, if you're always only going to be promoted as a political favor. And it also means that the bosses whom you have to work for, they might be outstanding, but they might not be. They might be there for a political appointment as a favor. They might not be very good. Most of the young, ambitious, entrepreneurial people I know want to work somewhere where their brilliance will be recognized, their talent and effort and energy will lead to their promotion, and where they'll be able to make a difference. So we can work on those things. And I think having world-class schools of government helps. It creates a track for people to join globally and share a purpose in sort of doing something with the public service or alongside the public service or getting closer to the public service through private enterprise. And all of that helps improve government.
Step by step. Yeah, the thing is, it can be very frustrating to be stopped because of red tape, because of the way policies are made, especially if you're not a partisan person. So maybe we can change a little bit. The question is, why is that we have this feeling that governments are failing us? Because one thing is, we should be attracting good, talented people. But why we don't have those people there? Beyond this red tape and political appointments, why are governments failing us everywhere, apparently? What's happening with this failing sentiment of lack of trust?
So I don't think governments are failing everywhere. Okay. I think government is really difficult. If the things that governments were supposed to do were easy, you wouldn't need government to do them.
Okay.
It'd be far easier for society simply to be organized in self-organized little groups and not to have governments. But we have to have governments because the tasks that governments have to take on are the most difficult. They're the ones that involve trade-offs, really uncomfortable, difficult trade-offs. Do we spend more on medicines for sick babies or more on medicines for, dying elderly? Like, these are difficult questions. And you can't just expect a society at large to make them because they don't have a mechanism. The mechanism is government. So government is difficult, but there's a lot that government quietly succeeds at. I think the reason why at the moment we live in a world where people feel not that government is failing, but that government is failing them, is because we're living in a decade where it looks to very many working people as though all the benefits of globalization are being channeled to a very small number of people at the top who are becoming exponentially wealthier, and that those people avoid all the responsibilities of normal people. If you're a teacher in Brazil, you have to pay your taxes, but perhaps if you're Google or Starbucks, you don't. And that enrages people. It enrages people that there's one standard for the super wealthy and a different standard for them as working people. And so it's not that government's failing, it's that government's failing them, and they don't trust it to act impartially anymore. And that, I think, is why in the United States and in Europe we've got these big anti-establishment movements that are taking off among exactly that demographic.
So is there any way we can help people understand how we can take back this feeling that the government is actually serving us and the purpose for the society and the groups that actually elected these representatives, right, to be there? What should we do? And
we need to do it collaboratively. It's really interesting to me that some of the most innovative ideas on what to do are coming from private sector leaders. And there's all kinds of ideas they're throwing out.
For the government?
Yeah, for government. Universal minimum income. It's an idea from the private sector. There are parts of the most successful private sector changing the terms for workers, giving them a better deal, making their working hours more regular, making their lives better, starting to realize that they need themselves to contribute to a sense of increasing well-being, so that everybody sees there being a stake in society instead of feeling that it wouldn't make much difference if you smashed it.
And I know that maybe you're not following what's happening in Brazil that much, but from an outsider point of view, what do you say? What can you say about what's happening at the moment with this process of people going to streets to protest? They were protesting before the impeachment, they were protesting after the impeachment, and some people are feeling that this is a huge crisis, not only for political parties, but economics, but also in the democratic institutions. And I don't know if we agree with that, but what's your feeling about it, or your opinion regarding what's happening in Brazil?
Yeah. So I guess I started studying Brazil as one of the many countries that had a sovereign debt crisis in the 80s.
Okay.
So the first thing I learned about Brazil was about the transition to democracy. This was a country that had had this dictatorship and was now a democracy. So seen from a distance, one of the things that really strikes me is that this is a pretty young democracy and its institutions are being really thoroughly tested. And what's impressive is that they're surviving and they're pushing back. And I'm sure it doesn't feel like that for Brazilians living in this period where you've been hit by an economic crisis, you've been hit by a political crisis, but the institutions are working. They're being tested to their limit, but it seems to me that they're working and that Brazil will come out of this strongly. For me, one of the roots of the crisis that Brazil is in at the moment is exactly the same for a whole lot of other countries. And the source of it is that when countries make windfall gains, when the price of oil suddenly goes up, or the price of gas suddenly goes up, or the price of corn rises, when commodity prices went up, there were dozens of countries in the world that suddenly had a whole lot more money. And it's almost a law of nature that a government that gets a whole lot of money fast will always spend it badly, that all the usual discipline, all the usual preparation, all the usual challenge for spending money goes out the window. So I could point you to dozens of other countries that, like Brazil, having enjoyed the boom of commodity prices, are now suffering the hangover afterwards because a lot of decisions were made too hastily, with profligacy, with corruption, with all of these temptations arise from the big inflow. So in a way, the big inflow was the problem. And perhaps one of the important things for Brazil is to create institutions for when that big inflow happens again, just as Chile did with its copper windfall gains fund, so that it could save for when the rain came later, saving for a rainy day.
We could actually observe what's happening also in Venezuela is the same path, right? But again, if we look at, you're mentioning different countries that are also facing this feeling of the government failing them. I don't know if you want to go there, but I'd like to ask you to comment on what's happening, especially in the United States and also in the UK after the Brexit vote.
Yeah. Well, in Britain, there are huge parts of the population that feel that government's failed them, and that's because Britain was at the front of the queue for the financial crisis in 2008, right? It began in Britain. And since that crisis, the government has very seriously cut public spending. And it's particularly cut the spending by local governments. Now, that doesn't affect me very much. The people it really affects are the people who depend on that local government spending because they've got disabled children, because they depend on government for welfare, for housing, for education. And those people have really suffered these cuts. In some sectors, the cuts have been 40%. So suddenly, services upon which these people absolutely rely have disappeared. And then you've got movements coming forward and saying the reason why you can't take your child to hospital and get a bed, or the reason why your schools aren't working very well, is because of all these immigrants. And actually, there's some pretty good research done in the Blavatinik School which shows it's not the immigrants, it's the government cuts. There's no correlation between a lack of services and parts of the country where you've got the most immigrants. It's the government cuts that have created the hardship. So, but it was a perfect storm, the Brexit referendum in Britain, because when people became persuaded that their lives had gotten worse because of the immigrants, they voted to come out of the European Union as a way to stop immigrants. And, you know, it was a very poorly evidenced, scrappy debate. And I think it's going to be a very, very difficult path for Britain ahead, because some of those same people that voted for Brexit are exactly the people who are working in car factories
that
owned by Japan. Yeah. And Japan just yesterday in Hangzhou at the G20 summit said that if Britain does lose access to the European single market, then Japanese investors will locate somewhere else in the European Union. So a lot of people will lose their jobs.
So it's a bad decision-making process, in a sense that from the voters' point of view, I was trying to get rid of the things that are causing me harm and just harming me more.
Well, I think for a lot of people, and certainly for me, it made me really think about referendums.
Okay.
And the fact that, you know, Mrs. Thatcher once said that the referendum is the tool for dictators and for demagogues. You know, I think on balance, I agree with her, because the governments say they're holding a referendum in order to consult the public. But there are lots of ways to consult the public, which are much better than referendums. You can try listening to what the public is saying for a start, instead of just asking them to tick yes or tick no. So it's not a good way to consult. But the thing that most worries me about a referendum, like the Brexit referendum, is that who takes responsibility for the decision? There's an elected government that should take responsibility for decisions, but when an elected government gives a decision to the people through a referendum, that nobody takes responsibility, because it's
for the aftermath.
Everybody takes responsibility, and therefore nobody does. And I think that's a very bad principle for accountable government.
Good point. But what do you make of what's happening in the US with this, you know, a lot of support for Trump and all the things that he's saying that he's going to do with the international community and the immigrants?
You know, I think American scholars have done a really fantastic job, some of the think tanks, at pulling the data together, which shows which Americans, and there's a huge number of Americans, whose lives are getting worse. And they've showed that America has sustained a period of real wage stagnation, of people's lives simply getting worse, and them losing the prospect that their children's lives will be better. And so I look at that demographic and I say, if that were me, and I were facing one candidate who tells me that she'll do her best to make it a bit better, and the other candidate who says, damn it, let's smash the system. If you feel you've got no stake in the system, it doesn't look like there's a cost to smashing it. So I think there's some of that. I also think that there's just a very obvious reason for thousands of people to show up to Donald Trump rallies, and that's because he's entertaining. He's unbelievably obnoxious and crude and rude and says things that are totally inappropriate, and we all love watching that. I mean, when I say we all love watching it, everybody finds it entertaining.
Yes, it is.
And
you can tweet about it.
Dave Eggers did a wonderful kind of essay about going to a Donald Trump rally where most people were there because it was entertainment. And I sat thinking, yeah, if Donald Trump came to Oxford, would I go along? I'd probably go along for the entertainment. But it's dangerous.
It is dangerous because it looks like endorsement, not just being entertained.
But I think on the serious side, what's dangerous about Donald Trump has nothing to do with politics or ideology or his party.
Okay.
It has to do with the fact that he actually is the first presidential candidate I can ever remember who is consciously hitting out at the three foundations of American democracy. He's saying when it comes to elections that they're probably all rigged, and therefore we shouldn't necessarily accept the result. He's saying when it comes to the rule of law, he's encouraging people to punch dissenters in the face and saying, and I'll cover your legal fees. This is, the rule of law is really important in America. It's a society made up of people from all different cultures, and what binds them together is a sense that they're all equal under the law. And third, the other thing about America that has held it together is the protection and respect of minorities. Now, it's not perfect, obviously. Mm-hmm. There's a huge race problem and such like. But to unleash the meanest spirited part of people, to tell them that there are whole parts of their community, you can't trust Mexicans, you shouldn't accept Muslims, it takes a machete to a foundation of American democracy. And if you take away a belief in electoral representation, a belief in the rule of law equally applied to everybody, and a belief in the protection of minorities, in my view, you are destroying the foundations of American liberal democracy. And as I said, that's not to do with an ideology or anything. It's just to do with a reckless politician who doesn't seem to me to think about what the foundations of American democracy are. He thinks on his feet and just says things that come to mind.
Maybe he's not really a political leader, but a political celebrity. Yeah. In a sense that he knows how to gather attention, but he doesn't really care about the consequence.
Yeah.
He sues the guys. I don't know if we can foresee what's going to happen, but what if he wins? I don't want to go there, but what if he wins? Because no one thought, I was there, no one thought that Brexit would happen, right?
Yeah. I asked this of Professor Joseph Nye because he's worked in US government. He was chairman of the National Intelligence Committee, and he came to speak at the Blavatinik School of Government. And what I wanted to know were what are the protections in the American political system? In what sense is it president-proofed? Is there a permanent staff in the White House? Are there advisory groups which immediately surround a president?
That can stop him, for instance.
Or that can ensure that the due reflection is given to that which he should reflect upon, as it were. In Britain, there's a permanent civil service that moves into action quite quickly, sometimes not quite quickly enough, but to stop politicians, saying things that are illegal or, taking actions that would be disastrous. And I think this possibility's got Americans really thinking about that, because it's not obvious what the protections are. I think there are people in the Republican Party who hoped that if Mr. Trump were to win the presidency, he would sit in the White House and they would take over running government. So the Republican establishment would roll out and run government, and Mr. Trump would be president in name. But actually it's a serious question, because the evidence, and you know, in the end, we should just look at the evidence of what people actually do. And if you look at the way his campaign team have been run, and you say, has this person shown that he can manage 6 people, define the goal, and mobilize them to achieve that goal? The answer is no. This is a very fractious team. People have been fired and replaced. They're at each other's necks, apparently. They're not moving together. If you can't mobilize the 6 people running your campaign, it's worrying how you're going to mobilize a government.
I think that's everything we have to talk about. But it is important, maybe as a final message, what should young people that are still willing to make a change, what should they do? What should we do if we want to make a change and see change happen in government or in society? Any piece of advice?
Yeah, work out what do you most want to change, and absolutely go for that one thing. Because it's quite rare that somebody sets a goal of one thing and puts all their energy into it, that they don't succeed. The reason why people don't succeed in changing things is usually because they're trying to change 12 things at once.
No focus.
And 1/12 of your brain, 1/12 of your energy is not going to change something. But if you put 100% of your effort, if you think carefully about what you're changing and why, and you put 100% of your effort into it, my advice to people is go for it, because you will change it. It's the tenacious that change things in the world. It's not necessarily the most brilliant or the most talented. It's the most tenacious.
Thank you very much for this talk.
Good.